Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Stepping Up. With me, Kindar, the Tiger Rights and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. Today, we are doing Chapter 107. Tibs trudged into the inn and looked around for the sorcerer. Tibs must have called worriedly on seeing him. It's not mine, he told the server, heading for his stable where Naz and Tirna were eating. Where's Dawn? He demanded. Tirna looked exhausted and barely looked. You know what? Was exhausted and barely looked up from the stew she ate mechanically. Thought he was with you, I said. When he didn't come down after me and Amelia, figured he'd help you from a safe distance. His team left the inn maybe 15 minutes before you got here, Yusuf said. Tibs, you should wash up. You're rather gory. He grabbed a tankard off the table and drained it. I'm not going to get any cleaner today. If you see Don, tell him I... Tibs put the tankard down, then shook his head at Yusuf's expectant expression. Never mind. I'll tell him myself when I find him. Now was not the time to start a fight with the sorcerer, knowing how badly he deserved it. He turned to head out and paused. Oh, if anyone asks, what happened to the block of houses by Edgerow? They did it. Tibs ran after another group of Sebastian's thugs and watched as one threw a pouch at a building. Tibs deflected it so it landed on the ground ahead of it, but it burst, and the everburn it contained splashed as it ignited, and the fire reached the house anyway. He didn't waste time pulling at the fire. He'd have to let the thugs get away for how long it would take for him to pull all that essence of it. It was like Everburn simply made the essence appear. Tibs had hoped the loss of the catapult would have broken Sebastian's people, not the man himself. Instead, the raids had redoubled, with them now using Everburn the way Tibs had just seen. And there were other groups of thugs throughout the town, burning down homes and shops. He tackled the slowest of the thugs in green and black, planted his sword in her back while the others kept running, and picked up the chase. Quigley felt this would be over quickly now. Tibs wasn't sure. Tibs wasn't so sure. But they didn't have the luxury of this stretching on. Yusuf's father had mentioned the people in the dungeon had no more than 2 days' food left, if they were careful how they ate. They had provisioned them, but once Stowe closed this door, he couldn't open it again until the attack was over. Otherwise, it would seem too suspicious. Animals sensed danger, and Stowe had been attacked already. Those Tibs could use to explain the dungeon's behavior if it came down to it. Anything else, and he'd be in trouble. So he needed to end this as fast as possible. The scream came as Tibs dispatched another one of what felt like Sebastian's unending supply of thugs. He'd fought them through the night as the sun rose, and it was just past the zenith now. He had no idea how many of them he killed, but it never seemed to be enough. The only part of the town free of damage and fighting was Noble's neighborhood, as they had adventurers blocking every alley leading to them. The scream came again, accompanied with mocking laughter. Multiple people laughing. He climbed the closest building and ran the roofs until he reached the courtyard, then dropped as he saw an archer scanning the roofs. He caught sight of two more and heard one of them let loose an arrow ahead of the scream coming yet again. See anything? A man asked. You really think this is going to draw him out? A woman answered. An arrow was loosed. A man screamed. This is a big town. There sensed 8 people in the courtyard, one of which was the man being shot, by the way his essence was broken, and he had an element. Corruption. Tibs considered leaving Dawn to his fate. It would serve him right for leaving Tibs to die. And there's a lot of people for us to use as bait. I want a reward. If you're not interested in it, why don't you go back and ask for kitchen duty? Tibs edged to the peak of the roof and peered over. Not that Tibs thought he was a better man than the sorcerer in saving him, or that it would show him who of the two was better. I'm here, she snapped, and the man screamed. I'm doing my part. he screamed again. I don't see you do anything other than stand there and watch, he screamed again. He screamed again. Tibbs needed Don. The man, as much of a coward as he was, knew strategy. He could speak to the people. He could calm even nobles. Tibbs hated him even more for how much Tibbs needed him to ensure the town survived. Careful where you aim. The point is to have him scream for as long as possible, not kill him. The building creating the courtyard also made 4 alleys between them. He could see 2, each with a thug in green and black holding swords. He leaned against the side of the building, watching the archers take turns shooting the man who was out of Tibbs' sight. He could sense the other 2 thugs at the mouth of the unseen alley. He considered turning away. I've always said. He considered turning away again, with Don had. No one would know. The man would just be yet another runner to die at the end of Sebastian's thugs. And the town would suffer more for Tibbs indulging his anger. He leaped over the peak and slid down the roof. The archer, keeping watch, loosed his arrow and missed. The house was only 3 stories. Tibbs wouldn't even need accents to drop. Told you! He surfaced his body with earth because this wasn't when he should take chances, and rolled and let it go to retake water as he stood. He had hold of the humidity as the archer loosed another arrow, stopping it as he formed a sword and shield. Dawn was conscious, and their eyes met. The man still had enough energy to look more scared on realizing who was saving him. Then Tibbs blocked the coming sword with his shield, and with a scream, he planted his sword into the thug, exploding it into a shard of ice. Don's team was on the ground, dead, got shot. He reformed his sword to parry another thug, kicked him away as an archer drew her bow. He sent an next attack and put enough essence into it she didn't get up. The man came back at him, more coming from the alley they had been guarding. An arrow hit him, and Tibbs didn't have the time to find the last archer as he dodged and parried. A sword came down hard, and somehow Tibbs' sword shattered under it. Cursing, Tibbs summoned a knife in his now free hand and planted it into the man's stomach, then ripped it out viciously before sending it back to its hiding place. A detail this would be another paragraph. A detail Stowe hadn't considered, which Tibbs appreciated, was that only the knife returned there, none of the blood it was coated with. Unless one less thing he had to clean when the battle was over. Tibbs sent another attack at the archer he could find, but the man jumped to the side, then 2 thugs were on him. That was the problem with that attack. Anyone who saw it once knew to get out of the way when he did the motion. He blocked the first attack and used his shield to bash her away, the spikes leaving her bloody, but only angrier. She came again, hard, but smarter, darting left and right. Without the mass most men had on them, her agility made even Tibbs' surprise attack of elongating his blade not as effective. He only nicked her. Fighting her to something of a stalemate and keeping an eye on the archer notching another arrow and worrying about the other archer he still hadn't located meant that the only thing that saved Tibbs from the sword in the back was that the sheet of ice covering his armor made it skid off and dig into the side instead. With a scream of rage and pain, he let go of his sword and grabbed the man's arm, pulling at the essence. He realized he was pulling water and not his element as the core reserve refilled, and the man's arm withered and he gasped. It happened so fast that he didn't understand what he'd done. The woman before him stared at him, her expression turning to horror. He had his sword in her before she could do more. The archer stood, bow drawn, and Tibs had water ready when the men glanced over at Tibs. He turned, icing the air between him and the hidden archer as she let her arrow loose. How she'd been hid from his senses would be a question to answer later. Same as how it was that same as how it was that arrow shattered his wall of ice and he landed on his back from the impact. It was in his shoulder. Fortunately, not deep enough for the barbs to rip his flesh. As he pulled it out and wrapped that injury, along with the one on in his side, with essence. He threw it to the side as he stood, only absently, thank you, noted the head was made of a green stone. He ran at her as she readied another arrow. She dropped it and pulled a sword. He blocked and maneuvered himself to place her between him and the other archer. Immediately she moved out of the way as she attacked. She was better than Tibs expected, and underestimated her, and underestimating her allowed her a few hits, but didn't get through his layers of armor. He wasn't used to an archer knowing how to fight with a sword. He even felt wrong for her to be that good. He intercepted the arrow with his shield and worried he'd made a mistake and allowed the repeat of the shattering of his wall, but embedded itself in the ice. He pressed her and she panicked. He used her uncoordinated retreat to dispatch her. The remaining archer turned to run, but Tibs had a wall of ice before him, then at his back, and he closed off the other side. He closed off another side, leaving him with only one option, facing Tibs. The archer fired arrow after arrow as Tibs walked in his direction. None of them hit. Water in the air caught them, made them fall, and by the time the man reached for his sword, it was too late. Tibs ran the last pace and shoved the man against the wall with his sword in his gut. The wound wasn't fatal. He was made sure of that. Knowing where people's essence was in their body told them where to strike to kill or not to kill. He left the sword in, rearranged its essence, made it a weave that caused the water around it to turn to ice, and let the weave spread. Tibs had no idea how long it would take for all the water in the man to be turned to ice, but he hoped, that it would not be a pleasant experience. One last thing to deal with. It located the sword that had shattered his, along with the arrow with the green stone. Now that he wasn't fighting for his life, he understood what had happened. The sword had a stone of the same color in the hilt. When he tried to reach for either with essence, he couldn't. The stone dissipated it before you know what? The stone dissipated it. Tibs knew Sebastian hadn't been close to the block of green stone when he'd shattered it. He also hadn't been able to take any before fleeing, which meant that he'd gotten these after the guild had collected them, and Tibs only knew only the guild had collected them. Why did it surprise him that Sebastian had been able to pay someone in the guild to give him some fragments? The men seemed to have more coins than could be counted, and the guild seemed willing to do anything so long as it brought the coins. He broke the tip of the arrow off, then shattered the hilt to retrieve that stone. He thought about putting them in his magical hidden places on his armor, but the way it disrupted essence couldn't be good for that. So they went into his pouch. Let the guild make an issue of him having those. He straightened, turned, and strode forward to the guild. I think I've just given myself something I can use in both. He straightened and turned and strode toward the sorcerer. Don was still alive. Considering the number of arrows in his arm, legs, and chest, Tibs was impressed. Dawn's terror rose as Tibs approached. The man said, the rest devolving into a gargle. Dick looked down on him, at him, not bothering to hide his anger. Did you hide behind them? Did you force them to fight for you until they were dead, Dawn? Did you fucking care? He yelled. Dawn shook his head and tried to say something. The blood dripped from his lips. He would die. Tips could see that in the way his essence was broken. He thought it was already fading. In someone without an element, this amount of damage would have killed them. In someone without an element, this amount of damage would have killed them long before Tips arrived. You could talk, Dawn. Could you give me even one reason and not to walk away right now and leave you to die? Please? He coughed and spat blood. He ground his teeth against the desire to just kill him. No one deserved to suffer. No one deserved to suffer like he was. To look at him with desperation and have to justify being saved. What you've done didn't come close to it. He was crouched. Can you melt the arrows? If I pull them out, I'm afraid I'll hurt you enough it might kill you. Please, don't manage to say I'm not letting you die. Dawn winced, shuddered, and cried. Can you melt the arrows? Sorcerer closed his eyes. Tibbs couldn't see his reserve, and while the concentration of essence gave him a sense of how powerful the runner was, it wasn't a representation of how empty the reserves were. With the strain on Dawn's face, by the strain on Dawn's face, he had little left. But the arrows fell out, leaving only corrupted goo in the wound. That was something Dawn didn't have to fear, since it was his element. Tibbs iced the injuries, wrapping them in his essence at the same time. Couldn't afford Dawn's essence to be any more disrupted while he carried it. Even if it didn't come with the sense of well-being healing that purity brought, Tibbs wasn't trying. Having met the two elements, he didn't believe the animosity clerics had toward anyone wielding corruption came from the elements, but he had no way to know how they would interact with the little control he had. Know how opposed essence. How opposed essence would interact with the little control he had. Yeah, one more thing, you'd have to figure out a way to practice. This isn't going to be pleasant, he told Dawn as the only warning. He closed his eyes, channeled earth, pulled the sorcerer over his shoulder, and stood. The man's whimpers were not something to be enjoyed. Tibbs repeated to himself as he started walking. His arrival, with Dawn over his shoulder, turned the inn into an even more chaotic place than it had been. Clara was horrified at the sorcerer's state, but at least she didn't seem worried that his element was corruption. As soon as Tibbs placed the man on the table, he switched back to water and hoped no one would question how he carried him all this way. Korsef grabbed his arm roughly and pulled him to the bar. You saved him? He demanded in a low, angry voice. Tibbs started tiredly. Don't even try to tell me it was the right thing to do. Maz thought he'd stayed behind with you. You had no idea where he was. That means the man left you to die. Tibbs, why the fuck did you save his miserable life? The town needs him. Korsef scoffed. How many of us are left, Crow? Tibbs winced at using Korsef's abbreviated name. It was Jackal's name for him, not. He's the hero. He's the hero of Craggle Rock. His death will kill morale. I'm not going to be the reason for that. And he's better at planning than I am. You have Quigley, you have Jack. Okay, sorry. I know he promised, but the only thing he's done since this started was go out and hit as many of them as he can. So Jackal's still out there? Yourself nodded. Have you seen the rest of the team? Maz left not long after you. He came back for some food, then went out hunting. Kirina would not listen to me and sleep. She's probably still out there with the other sorcerers controlling the fires, and Kumdar. If he's been in the inn since since last saw him, because he was at the table. I haven't seen him, but then again, the way he loves wrapping himself in shadows, now that he could be next to us and I wouldn't know it. He isn't, he said, grinning. Sometimes he thought the cleric felt about his new darkness robe the way Jackal thought about Crowson. Someone had to have noticed him vanishing in the shadows by now, and there was a risk Miguel would find out that Comdar didn't care. Rosa plopped the bowl of thick stew before Tibs. Eat. I'm okay. Eat, Tibs, the server ordered. Then you're going to rest. I don't care if you need it or not. I will tie you to a bed if needed. I'm not your man. I will get out of it. Has my man been telling you stories? Zeph asked, amused. Yes, Tibs groaned. He never listens when I tell him I don't want to know. Then, if you don't rest, I will tell you some of the things we've been getting up to that I know you wouldn't ever think of telling you. Tibs opened his mouth in protest, but the seriousness in Crusoe's eyes made him close it and take the spoon that waited next to the bowl. And this concludes chapter 107 of Stepping Up. 3 more to go after this. If you are enjoying this, please hit the like. Oh boy, please hit the bell. If you want to know when the next one is going to be, subscribe and hit. Oh man. Yeah, this is what you get to see. If you enjoy this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one is going to be, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it's up on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead, you want to read ahead, that's on my Patreon. I'm in the habit of saying that we're up to 9 chapters, but by the time this is out, the book will be complete. Draft of the book will be completed. So you'll be able to read all of it on my Patreon. If you want to watch me fumble my way through these live, it's on Twitch every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.